Hello and welcome to another lecture from the Babson Debate Union. In this lecture, we're going to be covering off the basics of how to do rebuttal in debate for all kind of new debaters that are joining the format, or potentially I've pointed you here because you may have missed the in-person version of this lecture. So I'm going to chat that through to you over the next 10 minutes. Perfect. A little tip before improvement before I start though, which is just take notes is my advice. They can be digital. I keep a physical folder where I take paper notes and I add them to my folder over time. I think it really helps the material stick. And also, when it comes to passing on advice to new people, it helps you remember what were the skills you had to acquire along the way. Because one day you will be a pro and no longer a novice. And these notes will be valuable to you for teaching novices again. So there are kind of, what is rebuttal? Rebuttal is just a fancy name for responding to something and explaining why it's wrong or untrue or not very good. It's pretty much attacking what the other team have said in their substantive case material. So when they stand up, you want to rebut things, especially if they're important things. So there's kind of four key types that are pretty broadly applicable, and I think they're really good for responding to other teams. The first I call deny, 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 which is just like, hey, here's why this isn't true. So if the other team claims that, I don't know, people are going to stop smoking when there's a ban implemented, you just say, hey, that's not true. And you give some reasoning behind that. In the same way you have to provide mechanisms for your substantive case, it's really important that you provide some kind of reasoning and logic for your rebuttal. So you might say, for example, there will be a black market that develops, and that'll be very effective at getting people who were going to smoke their cigarettes, because people are addicted. In the same way they can access drugs on the black market, they can access cigarettes. The next one is kind of the right reasoning but the wrong answer, which is pretty much like, hey, I agree that you guys had the right you guys had the right things that were happening, but they don't actually equal up to that, which sounds a little confusing, but I think it works really well with an example. So often teams will be like, hey, we're going to put a government curfew in place. They might say as an example of this, and they say, so because there's a government curfew, there's less people out at night, because people don't like breaking the law. And because there's that, there'll be less, riots, there'll be less pushback, there'll be less, things like this committed. And you might say, hey, I agree. I agree that there will be less people outside because there is these curfews implemented. But the problem is that doesn't mean that you're going to get less riots and crime, because the people that are out are really upset about these curfews for a number of reasons. You provide those number of reasons. So there'll actually be a lot more riots, even though there's fewer people out. That's just an example of that. Probably not the best one, but it gives you a little bit of an idea of how you can agree with their mechanisms but disagree with their outcome. The next one is mitigation, which is pretty much, hey, I would only turn to this when I can't already disprove it, because disproving it is the best way to go about it. But pretty much this is about shrinking down how much impact it has in the debate, right? So they may claim it impacts a lot of people, and you're going to say, hey, here's why it impacts a much, much smaller group in this debate. For example, they may make some crazy claim in the debate saying that secondhand smoke impacts everyone in a nation because everyone is around secondhand smoke at some point. And you're like, look, while that's true, and we agree that secondhand smoke is harmful, the truth is it only impacts people that live with smokers, because it requires a large amount of smoke getting in your lungs to actually have that impact. So it means it's a much smaller group. We're just talking about family members. We're talking about very close friends. We're not talking about the whole populace. Obviously, that's not as good as taking out as a whole, but it gives you some ability to reduce how much impact that has on the debate. And then finally, we've got weighting, which is very similar to mitigation, but what you're doing is you're holding it up against your own material. You're saying, hey, they've run an argument which tells us that we get this boost in GDP. People are a little bit better off. It's a small boost, they claim. But the problem is, on our side, we have proved that children are going to die in the hundreds of thousands in factories. and you say, hey, judge, here's why it's more important that we care about the hundreds of thousands of children dying in factories than that we care about a 5% boost in GDP. And you weigh those up. You say, it's significantly more harmful losing your life. There's only a small benefit, etc., etc. And you chat the judge through that, because that means that the judge is going to give your content more kudos, more credit in the debate, because you've weighted it over their content. Okay. The next thing I would say that will take your rebuttal to the next level, if that's like rebuttal 101, this is kind of like rebuttal 102 is my advice. And it's probably the biggest lift that I see debaters do that takes their rebuttal up a significant level. It really improves debaters. And it's the magic words, even if. So in the same way that we layer mechanisms, we say, hey, here's our first mechanism, here's our second mechanism in our substantive points. If you don't understand what I'm talking about, please go watch the substantive lecture. That'll cover off what I'm talking about. But when you have an understanding of rebuttal, you don't just want to give one of the 4 types I've given. If you can, you want to give more. So you might say, here's why it's not true, which is the deny, deny, deny. But even if that was true, here's some mitigation. Here's why it's not that important. So that would be 2 stages. And if it's really important, you can throw a 3rd stage in there. It's like, hey, here's why it's not true. Here's why it's not that important. Here's some mitigation. Here's some weighting. Here's why, even if it was as important as they said it was, it's not as important as what we're saying. And what happens here is it's really, really hard for teams to come back from this. Because when you're giving them all of these layers of responsive analysis, it can be very difficult to respond to it all, right? Because they may beat back the it's not true response, but they won't be able to beat back all of the different layers. So it makes it very difficult to recover from rebuttal assaults that use the words even if. So I highly recommend practicing using that. Okay. A little bit of general advice for rebuttal, which I think will help as well, which is prioritization and grouping. So regarding prioritization, I see lots of debaters when I judge go out there and say, hey, the opposition said this one thing which was really crazy and ridiculous, and I'm going to spend 2 to 3 minutes talking about this. And I'm like, look, I'm a reasonably intelligent judge, and I already knew that was a little bit ridiculous. And they only spent 10 seconds talking about it, so I kind of just ignored it. Was it bad for their case? Yes, but it doesn't ruin all the other very good material in their case. So I want you to kind of ignore the low-hanging fruit. If you do need to deal with it very quickly. But don't harp on and on and on about it. What you need to do is you need to go after the most dangerous stuff in their case. The stuff that you hear them say and you're like, dang, that is debate-winning material. Even if you don't manage to take it out in full, you just need to work towards taking it out. And that'll help you win the debate, even if you can't achieve it fully, even if you just achieve mitigation. So my advice is go for those most dangerous rebuttals and spend lots and lots of time on those rather than picking out individual things. The next thing is grouping. The truth is you can't actually have time in your speech to deal with all of the material that's come out from the other teams because just statistically there's not enough time unless you can speak insanely fast, which I don't recommend at all because the judge wouldn't be able to follow if you spoke that fast. So kind of the 3 birds with 1 stone approach, which is instead of dealing with each mechanism one at a time, if you can group up a lot of their arguments into, for example, hey, they talked about healthcare, let's deal with why the healthcare claims aren't true as a whole, rather than dealing with it a piece at a time. I think that's a lot more effective, and you'll see your rebuttal go a lot further because you've only got a limited amount of time. So it's about how do I make that amount of time go the furthest, and you'll do that by grouping up some of their arguments. Okay, finally, my advice is when you've done all this, you've done your rebuttal, you've picked out a really good target, which was not low-hanging fruit. You've given me your rebuttal, and not just one piece, you've given me a few layers to it. You've told me why it wasn't true, and told me why it's mitigated, etc., etc. If it's really important, I wouldn't do this for every single piece, but kind of just let me know generally what is the impact on your case? What is the impact on their case? Like, what is this doing in the debate as a whole? Because I want to know that as a judge because it helps me write down exactly how this is changing the debate. Because the truth is, as much as judges pretend we're miracle workers, we actually don't follow everything perfectly all the time. And so when you tell me what it's done, I'm much more willing to buy this. Please do not overstate your claims. Please don't say, hey, this wins us the debate, game over, because that's generally not the case. If it's just mitigated their case, let me know, hey, this mitigates their case analysis. It means it's way less impactful in the debate. You probably should weight our case analysis over it because of this. All the way through to, hey, this piece of analysis, this substantive that I've just disproved, is the cornerstone of their case. Their entire substantive relies on this analysis, and now that I've taken it out, this entire substantive has collapsed. It can't stand in the debate panel, and that's going to be very crippling to their case. So please let me know what you're going to be doing, because the reality is that a debate is fought on the judge's paper. And so if you can better explain to them what you're doing, they're more able to write that down and give you the win when they go away to judge. That's kind of my advice here. Okay, so hopefully you've got a reasonably good grasp on what the kind of core types of rebuttal are, which we've covered off in the front of this lecture. You'll probably need a lot of time to kind of learn a lot of these things because there's quite a lot in this lecture that I've kind of tried to cram in here. But regardless, I'm going to try cram a little bit more, and I'm going to give you some bonus types of rebuttal that I think are super effective, that I really like to see in debate, and I think are really useful to understand how they function. So, firstly, just thinking about your defensive versus offensive rebuttal. And what I'm talking about here is I see teams crazy over prioritize their offensive rebuttal in debate. Do I think there should be more offensive than defensive rebuttal? 100%. But what am I talking about here specifically? Well, what I'm talking about is teams are really big on being like, here's why the other team's wrong. Here's why their material's like mitigated. All these other things that I've just taught you. But what they don't do is defend their own case. Because the problem is, if you give the most incredible rebuttal in the world and you take out like 80% of their case, but they are really, really good and they take out your entire case and you have no substantive content standing at the end of the debate, it doesn't actually matter because you can't win the debate without a substantive contribution. So because of that, I advise you to at least spend a little bit of your rebuttal time defending your case from the attacks you've heard from the other side. So if they say this is wrong or this analysis isn't true, like bat back against that and say, here's why that's like, here's why it is true, or here's why there's another mechanism. Like, make sure your case is still standing. Do a little bit of like, like recovery, give it some band-aids, all those good things, just to make sure it's kind of standing and can last its way through the debate. The second piece I'd give you is kind of thinking about symmetry versus asymmetry. So symmetry is a really easy one to think about, which is just like, often teams try to say, hey, we're going to do this thing, but it's actually not very unique. What do I mean by that? So let's say we're in a debate about a ban on smoking. And one side's like, hey, we're going to ban smoking. The other side's like, great. We're going to do education in schools about why smoking's really, really bad. Literally, your first response out of your mouth should be that that is symmetrical. And your reason for it is because we can do education too, because there is a ban on drugs, but there is also education in schools to tell you why drugs are really, really bad. So when opposition teams in particular claim things, you need to make sure that those are exclusive to your side, because otherwise the other bench will come in and say, that's symmetric, it's the same. And you'll have done like 3 minutes of peddling and hard work to make a really, really good point. And in about 30 seconds of rebuttal, probably even less, the other team's just come through and been like, that's exactly the same, and nullified that entire case material. So I think that's a really good one to know. The other one is asymmetry. Often debaters like to claim that they can win everything. The truth is in debates that you do have to sacrifice some things. So I advise you to like bite the bullet on some things and just say, hey, we lose out on that, but we think we're winning on more important things from time to time. But that's a separate discussion. The problem is when people, what's a good example of this? Like, for example, I had a debate on kind of Middle Eastern like dictatorships, I think it was on. And it was like, I can't remember which dictatorship it was, but it was a specific dictatorship in the Middle East. And pretty much it was like this house would go through and like pardon people who were dictators, and they would give them like pardons, and they would allow them to peacefully step down and transition out of power, and we'd give them a bunch of economic incentives to do this to them as a person. And then we kind of were like, well, we think there's like more effective ways to do this, like military action, rah. And they're like, oh, by the way, we're also going to like do military action if it doesn't work. Like if this falls through, we're going to like go after dictators in the Middle East and we're going to like violently coup them. Was our case the best here? No. But what was key was that this was like asymmetric. You couldn't both peacefully transition people and violently coup dictators in the Middle East. The reason for this was because if you violently shot up the dictator in the country next door, and I know you did that, there's no way I'm about to start peace dealing with you because I'm worried that you're going to shoot me up as well, and I have zero trust that you're not going to do that mid-negotiations. So you massively reduce your power to do any sort of peaceful economic incentive removal from power. So I think that's a really good thing to flag when people are asymmetric. Okay, so thank you very much for tuning in. I hope this video has been helpful. If you've got any questions, you can always follow up at our trainings, or you can drop a message in the comments if we're on holiday at the moment, like we are as I'm recording these videos. But thank you very much for tuning in. Please give us a follow on Instagram because that'll let you know when our trainings are, because it may have changed semester to semester. I also promise you some really good funny debate content because my social media head is significantly more funny than I am, which will hopefully lead you to have some good laughs. I can't imagine you laugh too much during this lecture, so you probably need a few. Thank you very much for tuning in. Hope this has been helpful once again, and I wish you all the very best in your debating. Until we see you at a training, goodbye.